A millionaire chose his mistress over his wife, taking her to an important event, not knowing she was planning something huge. What she did next left everyone in shock. The grand ballroom shimmered under the soft glow of 1,000 crystal chandeliers, each refracting light in a way that made the entire room seem ethereal. The hum of conversation, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter filled the air with an unmistakable air of opulence. Elizabeth Carter stood near the elegantly adorned bar, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her wine glass, her emerald silk gown hugging her figure with the kind of understated elegance only she could pull off. She had mastered the art of blending into these gatherings, watching, listening, absorbing. Tonight, however, there was something unsettling in the atmosphere, a strange shift she couldn't quite place. Then, it happened. The murmurs began softly, barely noticeable at first, a ripple of whispers cascading from one end of the room to the other, like a quiet tide pulling everything in its wake. Elizabeth's practiced composure remained intact, but beneath the surface, her pulse quickened. She followed the collective gaze of the crowd, and there he was, James Holloway, her husband, her world. But tonight, he wasn't alone. Sophia Langley, the young socialite with a penchant for scandal and expensive champagne, stood at his side. Her red gown clung to her curves like a second skin, a sharp contrast to Elizabeth's refined elegance. The flash of cameras followed them as they entered, illuminating the room in bursts of blinding white light. James carried himself with his usual effortless charm, that signature smirk etched across his face, exuding an air of untouchable confidence. Elizabeth felt the room spinning, but she planted her heels firmly on the polished marble floor. She had covered enough scandals in her career as a journalist to recognize the raw elements of one brewing right before her eyes. Except this time, she was the headline. The betrayal stung, but it was the humiliation that settled deep in her chest, sharp and suffocating. James hadn't just betrayed her. He had orchestrated it for the world to see. A deliberate move, a calculated strike meant to strip her of dignity in front of their peers, the very people who had admired them as the perfect power couple. A waiter passed by, offering a fresh glass of champagne, but Elizabeth waved it away, her lips pressed into a tight smile, a mask she had perfected over years of navigating high society's treacherous waters. The whispers grew louder now, and she knew she had only moments to decide how to respond. James finally spotted her from across the room. For a fleeting second, something passed over his face. Hesitation? Regret? No, it was satisfaction. He wanted her to break, to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. Elizabeth lifted her chin and took a deliberate step forward. "James," she said smoothly, her voice slicing through the tension like a razor. Sophia's painted lips curled into a smug smile, her perfectly manicured hand resting possessively on James' arm. Elizabeth ignored her, keeping her gaze locked onto her husband. He looked down at her with that same casual arrogance he always wore, as if this was all a minor inconvenience he could smooth over with a few well-chosen words. "Elizabeth," James replied, his tone dripping with condescension. "You look radiant tonight." Elizabeth's lips twitched in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And you look predictable." Her words were a quiet dagger, slipping between the cracks of his carefully crafted facade. A flicker of annoyance passed through James' eyes, but he recovered quickly. "Come now, darling. Let's not make a scene," he murmured, his voice low but enough for those nearby to hear. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. A scene? That's what he thought she would do. Oh, how little he knew her. She leaned in, her voice laced with venom wrapped in velvet. "I wouldn't dream of it, James. Enjoy the evening. Both of you." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and walked away, her steps slow and deliberate, ensuring every eye in the room followed her. The weight of their gazes pressed against her back, but she refused to crumble under it. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. As soon as she was out of the crowd's view, Elizabeth exhaled sharply, leaning against a marble pillar in the dimly lit corridor leading to the exit. The laughter and chatter from the ballroom still echoed in her ears, but it felt distant, muted by the rush of emotions swirling inside her. Back at their penthouse, The silence was almost deafening. She tossed her clutch onto the sleek black marble countertop and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The lights of New York stretched endlessly before her, but tonight they brought her no comfort. Instead, they mirrored the emptiness inside her. Her mind raced through the years they had spent together. Every event, every whispered promise, every carefully constructed illusion. She thought of the nights she had waited up for him, the excuses she had accepted, the lies she had swallowed whole. And now, it was all unraveling in the most public way possible. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. James thought this was the end of the story, his final victory. But Elizabeth Carter was not a woman who accepted defeat easily. Her years in investigative journalism had taught her that the truth, when wielded correctly, was the most powerful weapon of all. And tonight, James had handed her the perfect ammunition. With renewed determination, she crossed the room to her desk, powered on her laptop, and began typing. Her fingers moved with precision, pulling from memory every inconsistency, every shadowy business dealing she had overlooked in the past. She had once chosen to turn a blind eye to his secrets, convincing herself that love was worth the compromise. No more. The lines on the screen formed the skeleton of something bigger, a story that would do more than just expose James Holloway's infidelity. It would destroy him, not with anger or emotion, but with facts, cold and undeniable. He may have embarrassed her tonight, but Elizabeth was playing the long game. And in a few days, James Holloway wouldn't just regret humiliating his wife, he'd regret ever underestimating her. Before we dive into what happens next, let me ask you, if you were in Elizabeth's shoes, what would you have done after that public humiliation? Would you have walked away quietly, or would you have done exactly what she's planning? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And hey, if you're enjoying the story so far, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories like this. Now, let's see what Elizabeth does next. The soft glow of Elizabeth's laptop screen illuminated the darkened penthouse as she sat at her desk, staring at the words she had typed. The cursor blinked in silent anticipation, mirroring the turmoil inside her. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city pulsed with life, but within these walls, a storm brewed. One that had been building long before tonight's public humiliation. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly, her thoughts spiraling back to the beginning. There was a time when she believed James Holloway was her fairy tale ending. A self-made millionaire, charming and ambitious, with a relentless drive that seemed unstoppable. In their early days, Elizabeth was drawn to his confidence, his vision, and the way he made her feel like the most important person in the world. But now, as she stared at the man she once loved in a glossy photograph on their mantel, all she could see were the cracks that had been there from the start. Elizabeth had always been skeptical of perfection. As a journalist, she had built her career on uncovering hidden truths, digging beneath polished facades to expose the stories people didn't want told. Yet, when it came to her own marriage, she had chosen to ignore the warning signs. She had chalked up his late nights at the office to the demands of his empire, dismissed his dismissive tone as stress, and explained away his growing emotional distance as a temporary phase. Deep down, she had known better. It wasn't just the nights he came home smelling of expensive cologne that wasn't his own, or the brief flashes of guilt that flickered in his eyes before he buried them behind his usual charming smirk. It was the way he slowly stopped looking at her like she was his equal, how he started treating her more like a decoration to his success, a perfectly curated piece to complete the illusion of the perfect power couple. Elizabeth remembered their first red carpet event as husband and wife, how she had stood proudly beside him, smiling for the cameras while James whispered sweet nothings in her ear. Back then, she believed those words, believed in him. But now, as she reflected on those moments, she saw them for what they truly were. Empty words masking a man who had always craved power more than love. Her thoughts drifted to Sophia Langley. The woman was everything Elizabeth wasn't. Young, uninhibited, and utterly shameless. James had always been drawn to admiration, to the kind of attention that came easy, and Sophia offered it on a silver platter. Elizabeth had heard whispers about their affair for months, passing comments at events, subtle smirks from people she had once considered friends. She had convinced herself that it was all speculation, that James wouldn't be reckless enough to risk their reputation. She had been wrong. Tonight, as she watched him flaunt his betrayal so brazenly, Elizabeth realized something chilling. James didn't fear consequences. He had built an empire on carefully calculated risks and ruthless decisions, and now he had applied the same strategy to their marriage. He believed she would stay silent, that she would protect his reputation because that's what was expected of a woman in her position. But James had underestimated her. Elizabeth turned her attention back to her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keys. She had spent the last few months investigating corruption within corporate circles, peeling back layers of deceit and power plays, never realizing that the biggest scandal of all had been living under her own roof. Through her investigations, she had stumbled upon something buried deep within James' financial empire. A series of off-the-record deals, shadowy partnerships, and investments that didn't quite add up. At first, she thought it was merely a series of oversights, but the deeper she dug, the more it became clear. James was hiding something bigger than an affair. Elizabeth recalled a conversation she had with Nathan Cole, her longtime friend and investigative partner, a few weeks ago. Over coffee in their favorite corner cafe, he had mentioned rumors of questionable transactions linked to Holloway Enterprises. At the time, she had brushed it off, unwilling to believe that James was capable of anything beyond his well-documented arrogance. But now, in the aftermath of his very public betrayal, she found herself questioning everything. What else had he been lying about? Elizabeth opened a folder marked Holloway Holdings and scanned the contents. Documents, financial statements, offshore accounts. All pieces of a puzzle she hadn't dared to put together until now. She scrolled through the names, her eyes landing on a particularly familiar one. Langley Investments. Her breath caught in her throat. Sophia wasn't just some random mistress. She was part of something deeper, something entangled with James' business dealings. Elizabeth's journalistic instincts kicked in, her mind racing as the pieces started falling into place. Was this just an affair, or was it something far more calculated? Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she cross-checked dates, transactions, and names. The connections were subtle, but they were there. Money flowing into offshore accounts linked to Sophia's family, properties being purchased in her name, and suspicious transfers that coincided too neatly with some of James' high-profile business deals. A sick feeling settled in Elizabeth's stomach. This wasn't just betrayal. It was fraud, manipulation, and corruption on a scale she hadn't anticipated. Elizabeth stood from her chair, pacing the room. Anger burned beneath her skin. But more than that, there was a deep, seething sense of purpose. She had spent her career exposing men like James, arrogant, ruthless, believing themselves untouchable. And now, fate had delivered her the most personal case of all. She picked up her phone and dialed Nathan. "I need your help," she said, her voice steady but laced with determination. "Elizabeth," Nathan's voice crackled through the line, concern evident. "I saw the photos. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said quickly, "but I need to go deeper. There's something bigger here than just an affair. James is involved in something serious, and I need to know exactly what it is." There was a pause on the other end. "You sure you want to go down this road? This could get messy." Elizabeth's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm already in it, Nathan. I just need to make sure I finish what I started." As she hung up, Elizabeth felt a weight settle over her. The marriage she had fought so hard to preserve was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. But she wasn't here to play the wounded wife anymore. No, she was going to be the woman who tore down James Holloway's carefully constructed empire, brick by brick. And when she was done, he wouldn't just lose her. He would lose everything. The morning after the gala, Elizabeth sat at the breakfast table in their sleek penthouse, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. The soft hum of the city below served as white noise, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within her. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind in excruciating detail. James's smirk, Sophia's predatory gaze, the whispers, the flashing cameras. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was a spectacle, a carefully orchestrated humiliation. Elizabeth took a slow sip of her coffee, her hands trembling only slightly. She wouldn't break. Not yet. Across the room, James stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, dressed impeccably in his tailored suit, as if nothing had happened. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You didn't sleep," he said casually, breaking the silence. Elizabeth didn't look up. "Neither did you," she replied, her voice steady. James chuckled, stepping closer. "I expected a bigger reaction," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee, his tone almost amused. "You surprised me, Liz." She finally met his gaze, her eyes cold, calculating. "You think you know me so well, don't you, James?" A flicker of something, doubt, perhaps, crossed his face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "We've been married for 8 years, he said smoothly. "I know exactly how you operate. You analyze, you write your little stories in your head, and then you let it go. It's how you deal with things." Elizabeth set down her cup and leaned back in her chair, observing him. "You're right about one thing," she said, her lips curling into a small, unreadable smile. "I do analyze, but letting it go? That's not something I'm planning to do this time." James sighed, shaking his head. "Liz, let's not turn this into something ugly. I know you're upset, but these things, they happen. We can work through it." Elizabeth felt the anger rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay composed. "These things?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "You mean affairs? Public humiliation? Or are we talking about the lies, the deception, the way you paraded her around like I don't even exist?" James rubbed his temple, clearly annoyed. "Look, let's not pretend our marriage has been perfect," he said dismissively. "You've been married to my work more than to me, and honestly, you're not exactly the easiest person to love, Elizabeth." There it was, the shift of blame. Elizabeth smiled tightly, pushing back her chair and rising to her feet. "You're right, James. I may not be easy to love, but at least I know the difference between love and power. You don't." His jaw clenched, but he said nothing as she walked past him, her heels clicking against the marble floor. He thought he had won this round, that his arrogance and wealth would once again smooth over the cracks. He was wrong. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth sat in her office at the Post, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she pulled up files she had discreetly gathered over the past few weeks. Suspicion had been simmering in her mind long before last night's event, and now, with a renewed sense of purpose, she began connecting the dots. James had always been meticulous in his business dealings, too meticulous. Every investment, every acquisition was wrapped in layers of complexity, but Elizabeth had noticed inconsistencies. There were properties bought and sold under shell companies, anonymous offshore accounts linked to names that, upon closer inspection, were all connected to James in some way. And then there was Sophia. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. Sophia Langley wasn't just a mistress. She was a carefully placed pawn. The bank statements, the luxury cars, the sudden spike in her net worth. It all pointed to something bigger. James wasn't just indulging in an affair. He was using Sophia to move money, to hide something Elizabeth couldn't yet see. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. Nathan Cole stepped in, his expression grim. "I got your message," he said, closing the door behind him. "What's going on, Liz?" Elizabeth exhaled sharply, motioning him over. "James," she said simply, turning her screen to show him the evidence. "I think he's laundering money through his company using Sophia." Nathan's brows furrowed as he scanned the documents. "Jesus, Liz. This could take him down. Are you sure about this?" She nodded, her jaw set. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. But I need more. I need concrete proof." Nathan studied her for a long moment before leaning in. "Look, I know you want to take him down, and I get it. But this is dangerous territory. If James finds out you're digging into his business, things could get ugly." Elizabeth met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "They're already ugly, Nathan, and I won't stop until I have everything I need to expose him." Nathan sighed. "All right, I'll pull some strings, see what I can find on his offshore holdings. But Liz, be careful. You know what kind of man James is." Elizabeth nodded, the weight of Nathan's words settling in her chest. She did know. James wasn't just a businessman. He was a strategist, someone who played the long game with no hesitation in eliminating obstacles. But this time, Elizabeth was ready. That evening, Elizabeth returned home to find James sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out at the city lights. He turned when she entered, his eyes studying her carefully. "You're quiet tonight," he remarked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Planning something?" Elizabeth smiled faintly. "Just reflecting, James. You've given me a lot to think about." James chuckled, leaning back into the couch. "I hope you're not planning to turn this into one of your little articles. That would be unfortunate." Elizabeth met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw it, fear. Buried beneath layers of arrogance, there was a flicker of uncertainty. She stepped closer, standing over him. "Oh, don't worry," she said softly, her voice laced with quiet menace. "When I write something, it's always the truth." James studied her, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice lower now, "you know how this game works. I wouldn't push me if I were you." Elizabeth smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then you should have thought twice before making a fool of me, James. Because you've just started a war you won't win." She turned and walked away, leaving James sitting there, the weight of her words settling into the silence of the room. In that moment, Elizabeth knew there was no turning back. The cracks had been there for a long time, but now, they were about to shatter completely. Elizabeth sat at her desk, the glow of her laptop screen casting a pale light across her face as she scrolled through pages of financial records, offshore account statements, and business transactions. Each document a carefully constructed facade of James Holloway's empire. She had spent years perfecting the art of unraveling the lies of the rich and powerful, but this time, it wasn't just another investigative piece. This was personal. A soft knock on her office door made her glance up. Nathan stepped in, his expression tense, carrying a thick manila folder in one hand and a coffee in the other. He placed both on her desk, leaning over her chair to glance at the documents she had pulled up. "This is bigger than I thought," he said, flipping through the folder. "James isn't just moving money around. He's laundering it through shell corporations, using Sophia as a front." He paused, lowering his voice. "Liz, he's in deep with some dangerous people." Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, taking a steadying breath before replying. "I had a feeling," she murmured, taking the folder and sifting through the reports. "Sophia's connection isn't just personal. She's involved in the transactions, signing off on deals, attending meetings under James' instructions." She pointed to a scanned document. "Look at this. Properties bought under her name, but funded by accounts linked directly to Holloway Enterprises." Nathan sat across from her, rubbing his temple. "You realize what exposing this could mean, right? This isn't just about him cheating on you anymore, Liz. This is fraud, tax evasion, hell, even money laundering. If we go public with this, James will be ruined." Elizabeth's lips pressed into a thin line. "Good," she said, her voice cold. "He didn't just humiliate me, Nathan. He made me a laughingstock. But this is how I take back control." Nathan sighed, clearly torn. "I get it, Liz. I do. But the man you're going up against isn't the one you married 8 years ago. James will fight dirty. He'll come after you with everything he's got." Elizabeth's eyes darkened, determination hardening her features. "Let him. I'm not afraid of him." Nathan studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right. What's the next move?" Elizabeth stood and walked to the large window overlooking the city, her arms crossed. "I need to build the case slowly, strategically. If I release everything at once, he'll bury it with his legal team. No, I need to leak pieces of it, create doubt in the media, force his hand." Nathan smirked. Classic Carter, always thinking 2 steps ahead. She turned to him with a knowing smile. "And I'm counting on James to think I'm playing checkers when I'm playing chess." That evening, Elizabeth sat in their penthouse dining room, the tension between her and James so thick it was suffocating. He glanced up from his plate, his expression too casual. "You've been busy today," he remarked, sipping his wine. Elizabeth met his gaze, her face a mask of indifference. "Work keeps me busy. You'd know, wouldn't you?" she said, the edge in her voice unmistakable. James chuckled, setting his glass down with a soft clink. "Come on, Liz. Let's not pretend we're strangers. We know how this works." She tilted her head, studying him. "Do we? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like I'm just now getting to know who you really are." His smirk faltered for a second, but he recovered quickly. "You always did like digging for dirt," he said smoothly. "It's in your nature. But some things are better left buried, darling." Elizabeth leaned forward, her tone deceptively sweet. "And some things have a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deep you try to bury them." James regarded her carefully, and for the first time, Elizabeth saw something flicker in his eyes, uncertainty. She was getting to him. Over the next few days, Elizabeth played her cards carefully. She arranged accidental leaks to a few trusted reporters she knew wouldn't hesitate to dig deeper. Small details, whispers of questionable offshore accounts, a suspicious land purchase in James' name. Just enough to plant the seed of doubt in the minds of the public and, more importantly, his investors. She watched with satisfaction as the financial news circuit started buzzing with speculation, and James began receiving frantic calls during dinner, his face growing more tense with each passing day. One night, as James slammed his phone down on the marble counter, Elizabeth looked up from her book, feigning curiosity. "Trouble at work?" she asked innocently. James shot her a sharp look, his patience wearing thin. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" His voice carried the edge of suspicion. Elizabeth shrugged, offering a mild smile. "Why would I? Your business affairs never interested me. Until now." James stared at her, his jaw clenched. "You're playing a dangerous game, Liz." Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, meeting his gaze head-on. "No, James. You started this game. I'm just making sure I finish it." A few days later, Elizabeth met Nathan in a quiet cafe downtown, where the soft murmur of conversations drowned out their own. He slid a USB drive across the table. "Everything you asked for. His offshore accounts, hidden assets, fake business fronts. It's all here." Elizabeth picked up the drive, turning it in her hands. "This is enough to bring him down?" Nathan nodded grimly. "If it gets out, it'll be the end of Holloway Enterprises. No coming back from this." She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of it in her palm. This was it, the culmination of years of lies and betrayal. She could expose him, take away everything he valued more than her. But something inside her stirred, a tiny flicker of doubt. Did she really want to destroy him, or did she just want him to feel what she had felt? Nathan watched her carefully. "You okay?" Elizabeth slipped the drive into her purse, offering him a thin smile. "I will be." That night, Elizabeth walked into the penthouse to find James waiting for her in the dimly lit living room. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "You've been busy," he said. Elizabeth met his gaze without flinching. "So have you." James stood, walking towards her slowly, his eyes dark. "We don't have to do this, Liz. You can walk away. We both can." Elizabeth felt the tension coil tighter in her chest. "And let you win?" She shook her head. "No, James. That's not how this ends." James studied her for a moment before stepping closer, lowering his voice. "Then you should know. I don't lose." Elizabeth smiled, a dangerous glint in her eyes. "Neither do I." As she walked past him, she could feel his eyes on her back, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was the one in control. James Holloway had built an empire on deceit and manipulation. Elizabeth Carter was about to tear it down, brick by brick. The city skyline stretched endlessly before Elizabeth as she stood by the penthouse window, her reflection faint against the glass. The hum of New York at night was a distant murmur, the lights below flickering like stars in a man-made galaxy. But Elizabeth wasn't admiring the view. Her mind was a battlefield, torn between the weight of the evidence she had gathered and the quiet storm building inside her. James had been cautious over the years, but not cautious enough. Every transaction, every dubious offshore account, every shadowy deal he had orchestrated had left a trace. And now, she had the proof. The power was in her hands. Yet, Something gnawed at her. The knowledge that what she was about to do would shatter their world in ways neither of them could recover from. Their marriage had already been reduced to a battlefield of silent glances and veiled threats. But this would be the final blow. Behind her, the sound of footsteps echoed through the penthouse, growing louder until James appeared in the reflection of the glass. He stood there, watching her, the familiar smirk tugging at his lips, but there was something different in his eyes tonight. Something cautious, something wary. "You've been awfully quiet these days," James said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Should I be worried?" Elizabeth turned slowly, offering a small, measured smile. "Should you?" He chuckled, but it lacked the usual confidence. "Come on, Liz. We're both too smart for this little cat-and-mouse game." He took a sip of his whiskey, his gaze never leaving hers. "If you're planning something, just say it." Elizabeth stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "What if I told you I already did?" James' jaw tightened, just barely, but enough for Elizabeth to notice. He set his glass down with an audible clink, his eyes narrowing. "I see. And what exactly have you done?" Elizabeth crossed her arms, leaning slightly against the window. "I've been asking myself the same thing, James. What have you done? Offshore accounts, fake shell companies." Money quietly moved through Sophia Langley's name. Her voice was calm, but the weight of each accusation hit its mark. James remained motionless, but Elizabeth could see the wheels turning in his head. He was calculating his next move, the same way he always did when backed into a corner. Finally, he exhaled through his nose and leaned back against the bar, feigning relaxation. "You know, Liz," he said smoothly, "you really should have been a lawyer. You're so good at making accusations without proof." Elizabeth smiled coolly and pulled her phone from her pocket, tapping the screen once before holding it up for him to see. "Oh, I have proof," she said. "Would you like to see it? Or would you prefer I send it to my editor at the Post?" James' face darkened. For the first time in a long time, the arrogance slipped, replaced by something far more satisfying, fear. "You wouldn't," he said, though the certainty in his voice was wavering. Elizabeth tilted her head. "Wouldn't I? You of all people should know by now, James. I don't bluff." The tension thickened between them, filling the space like a suffocating fog. James stared at her, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the flicker of a vein in his temple. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice low, controlled. Elizabeth stepped closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "I want you to understand what it feels like to lose everything. To feel powerless, helpless." She studied him carefully. "And I want to watch you fall, James." Slowly, his eyes flickered with something dangerous. Panic, perhaps, or the realization that Elizabeth was no longer the woman he could manipulate with empty promises and lavish gifts. But James Holloway wasn't one to go down without a fight. "You think you're so clever," he murmured, his tone edged with menace. "But you're playing with fire, Elizabeth." She smiled, undeterred. "Then I guess I'll have to be careful not to get burned." The next few days were a carefully orchestrated dance. Elizabeth made sure to keep her moves subtle, allowing James to believe he still had some control, while in the background, she worked tirelessly to bring his empire crumbling down. Small leaks to the press, an anonymous tip here, a whispered rumor there, were beginning to stir unease among his investors. James was being called into emergency meetings more often, his once unshakable confidence beginning to fray at the edges. Elizabeth watched it all unfold from a distance, quietly savoring each sign of his unraveling. One evening, she received a call from Nathan. "It's working," he said, excitement lacing his voice. "Rumors are flying, and some of his board members are starting to question his leadership." Elizabeth allowed herself a small smile. "Good. But we're not done yet." Nathan hesitated. "Liz, I have to ask, are you sure you want to go through with this? There's no turning back once it's all out there." Elizabeth stared out at the skyline, her voice calm and certain. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." At home, James' patience was wearing thin. He watched Elizabeth with careful suspicion, as though expecting her to slip up and reveal her hand. But Elizabeth was careful. She continued with their routine, played the part of the composed wife, even sharing polite conversation over breakfast. But every now and then, she'd catch him staring at her across the table, his eyes searching, wondering just how much she knew. The truth was, she knew everything. Late one evening, as Elizabeth sat on the balcony with a glass of wine, James joined her, his silhouette looming behind her. "Liz," he said after a long pause, his voice quieter than usual, "why are you doing this?" She didn't turn to face him. Instead, she let the cool breeze wash over her, swirling the wine in her glass. "Because you left me no choice, James," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You could have just walked away." Elizabeth finally looked at him, her eyes hard. "And let you get away with everything? No, I won't make it that easy for you." James studied her, something almost resembling regret flickering in his gaze. But Elizabeth knew better. Men like James didn't regret their actions, only getting caught. "You should be careful," he warned, his voice soft but laced with unspoken threats. "There are things you don't understand." Elizabeth held his gaze, unflinching. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you brought your mistress to our anniversary gala." James smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've always been a fighter, Liz. But let me remind you, fights have consequences." Elizabeth leaned in slightly, her voice low and deadly. "So do betrayals." And with that, she stood, walking past him without another word, leaving James standing in the dark. He had no idea how much further she was willing to go. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here. The newsroom at the Post was alive with the usual bustle. Reporters huddled over their desks, phones ringing incessantly, and the distant hum of printers churning out drafts. Elizabeth sat at her desk, fingers poised over her keyboard, staring at the final draft of the article that could destroy James Holloway. The headline stared back at her with a cold, undeniable truth. Inside Holloway Enterprises, a web of corruption and betrayal. Her heartbeat drummed in her ears as she hovered over the send button, the culmination of weeks, no, years, of suppressed anger, humiliation, and disappointment. Once she hit send, there would be no turning back. James would face the fallout, his empire would crumble, and the world would finally see him for what he truly was, a fraud. Nathan appeared at her side, leaning against her desk with a cautious expression. "Liz," he said, his voice low, "are you sure about this? Once this goes live, it's war." Elizabeth glanced at him, her green eyes burning with a quiet resolve. "It already is," Nathan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I know James put you through hell, but this isn't just about him. You know how these scandals go. People will dig into you, too." Elizabeth's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Let them. I have nothing to hide." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but just so you know, once this hits, Holloway Enterprises won't go down quietly. James will fight back." Elizabeth turned her gaze to the glowing screen in front of her. "Let him." With that, she pressed send. The reaction was immediate. Within an hour, the article spread like wildfire. Financial news sites picked up the exposé, social media erupted with speculation, and Holloway Enterprises stock began to nosedive. Investors panicked. Journalists swarmed the company headquarters. Reporters stationed outside their penthouse shouted questions to anyone who entered or exited the building. Elizabeth watched it all unfold from her office, her phone vibrating with non-stop notifications. She ignored them. Instead, she opened her email inbox, scanning through dozens of messages from anonymous sources, all eager to contribute their own piece of the puzzle. She took a deep breath and stood, smoothing down her blouse. It had begun. Back at the penthouse, James stormed through the door, his face red with fury. Elizabeth was seated on the couch, a glass of wine in her hand, calm and composed. "You think this is funny?" he hissed, tossing a printed copy of her article onto the coffee table. The pages fanned out, the bold headline screaming up at them both. Elizabeth took a slow sip, savoring the moment before she replied. "Not funny, James," she said, setting her glass down. "Necessary." James clenched his jaw, pacing like a caged animal. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" You've destroyed everything I built." Elizabeth's gaze never wavered. "I exposed the truth. There's a difference." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You think you're the hero in this? You're just as ruthless as the people you write about." She tilted her head, unfazed. "Maybe, but at least I'm honest about it." James ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "They're freezing my accounts, Liz. Clients are backing out. I'm getting calls from my lawyers every minute." Elizabeth leaned back into the couch, crossing her legs. "Good. Maybe now you'll know how it feels to have everything you've worked for ripped away in an instant." James glared at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "You wanted revenge. Congratulations. You got it." Elizabeth's expression hardened. "This wasn't revenge, James. It was justice." He fell silent, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. After a long pause, he muttered, "What are you going to do now? Destroy everything?" Elizabeth stood, smoothing down her dress. "I don't have to. You're doing that all by yourself." James watched as she walked past him, the realization sinking in that she had outplayed him completely. As the days passed, Elizabeth's exposé continued to unravel James' empire. His mistresses came forward with their own stories, former employees leaked damning emails, and government agencies launched investigations into his financial dealings. The man who once held the world in his palm was now reduced to a headline, a cautionary tale of greed and betrayal. But Elizabeth wasn't done yet. One evening, she sat down with a well-known television anchor for an exclusive interview. Under the harsh studio lights, she faced the camera, poised and articulate. "Why did you do it?" the interviewer asked. "Why expose your own husband?" Elizabeth took a breath, her hands steady on the armrest of the chair. "Because the truth matters. Because people like James Holloway thrive on power and deception, and it's time we stop letting them get away with it." The interviewer nodded. "Do you regret it?" Elizabeth's lips pressed into a small, thoughtful smile. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I regret not doing it sooner." The segment aired that night, and within hours, Elizabeth Carter became a symbol of empowerment, praised by many, criticized by others, but undeniably respected. James, on the other hand, was falling apart. Late one night, Elizabeth found him in the penthouse, sitting in the dark with a drink in hand. His once pristine suit was rumpled, his hair slightly disheveled. The man who once radiated power now looked lost. "You got what you wanted," he said, his voice hoarse. "Are you happy now?" Elizabeth watched him for a long moment before replying. "I didn't do this to be happy, James. I did it to be free." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "And now what? You move on with your life while I pick up the pieces?" Elizabeth walked over, standing beside him. "I warned you," she said softly. "You should have never underestimated me." James looked up at her, and for the first time, Elizabeth saw something raw in his eyes. Defeat, regret, maybe even a touch of admiration. But it was too late. With one final glance, Elizabeth turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the darkness. The scandal would continue to unravel, the headlines would keep rolling in, but for Elizabeth, it was over. She had finally taken back control of her life, and as she stepped out into the crisp night air, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. James Holloway had thought he could publicly humiliate her and walk away unscathed. He was wrong, and Elizabeth Carter was just getting started. Elizabeth stood in front of the newsroom window, staring out at the city she once loved but now saw with different eyes. The world below moved on, oblivious to the storm she had unleashed. James Holloway's empire, once seemingly untouchable, was crumbling in real time, and she had front-row seats to its destruction. The fallout had been swift and relentless. Her exposé had triggered an avalanche of investigations. Holloway Enterprises was under scrutiny from federal agencies. Shareholders were in a frenzy, and media outlets dissected every inch of James' downfall. News anchors spoke of it with practiced neutrality, but Elizabeth could see the barely concealed schadenfreude in their eyes. After all, there was nothing the public loved more than the mighty falling from grace. Her phone buzzed on the desk behind her, breaking the silence. It was Nathan. Again. Still hiding from the world, Carter? His voice crackled through the speaker. I'm not hiding, Elizabeth said, her voice steady. I'm observing. Nathan sighed. James is calling in every favor he's got. He's fighting back hard. His lawyers are trying to spin the story, paint you as the bitter wife looking for revenge. Elizabeth smirked. Let them try. The facts are on my side. Facts don't matter as much as perception, Nathan warned. He's pulling strings in the media. Some of the outlets are already running pieces questioning your motives. Elizabeth crossed her arms, exhaling slowly. Let them dig. They'll find exactly what I want them to find. Nathan chuckled. You really are something else, Liz. That's why you love me, she teased, though her voice lacked warmth. Send me everything you've got. I want to know what his next move is. Already on it, Nathan said before hanging up. Elizabeth sat down at her desk, staring at the reports pouring in. Every financial misstep, every shady deal. She had laid it all bare for the world to see. But James wasn't the type to go down quietly. He thrived on control, and she had stripped it from him piece by piece. Now, the game was about survival. At the Holloway Enterprises headquarters, James sat in his corner office, the once grand space now feeling like a cage. His legal team surrounded him, their voices blending into a dull hum of damage control strategies and legal jargon. We need to hit back hard, one of his lawyers insisted. We're bleeding money, losing clients. This narrative is killing us. James leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the mahogany desk. He wasn't used to being on the defensive, and he hated it. His entire career had been built on power, precision, and ruthlessness. And now, Elizabeth had ripped it all apart with a single article. His mind raced through possible countermoves. He could spin this, manipulate public perception, paint himself as the victim of a vindictive ex-wife. The media loved a redemption story, after all, but deep down, he knew Elizabeth. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. Find something on her, James said suddenly, his voice sharp. Anything. I want dirt. Old stories, mistakes, something we can use to discredit her. His chief advisor, Mark, exchanged a glance with the others. We've already started looking, but Elizabeth Carter is clean. Her career is spotless. There's nothing that sticks. James clenched his jaw. Everyone has skeletons, Mark. Find hers. But he knew better. Elizabeth was meticulous. And if she was playing this game, she had already accounted for his every move. Meanwhile, Elizabeth had begun to see the ripple effects of her exposé in her personal life. Calls from mutual friends went unanswered. The invitations to charity galas and high society events had stopped coming. The once invisible social walls were closing in on her. But she didn't care. One afternoon, as she walked through Central Park to clear her mind, a familiar voice called out from behind her. Elizabeth. She turned to find Sophia Langley standing a few feet away, looking far less glamorous than she had at the gala. Gone were the designer dresses and polished facade. In their place was a woman with tired eyes and an edge of desperation. I figured you'd come find me eventually, Elizabeth said coolly. Sophia shifted uncomfortably. You don't understand what you've done. James, he's dangerous. And now that you've exposed him, he's going to come after you. Elizabeth's lips curled into a smile. Let him. He already did enough damage. It's time he learned what it feels like. Sophia hesitated before speaking again. You think you're safe because you exposed him? You don't know the half of it. He has connections, ones that don't play by the rules. Elizabeth's smile faded. There was something in Sophia's voice, genuine fear. A flicker of doubt passed through Elizabeth's mind, but she quickly buried it. She couldn't afford to waver now. You made your bed, Sophia, Elizabeth said, her voice sharp. Enjoy lying in it. Sophia's eyes darkened. I hope you know what you're doing, Elizabeth, because James won't stop until he's destroyed you. Elizabeth watched as Sophia walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement. She let out a slow breath, her grip tightening around her phone. She knew James wouldn't go down without a fight, and she was ready for it. The next morning, Elizabeth found herself standing outside the courthouse, surrounded by a sea of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in her face, and voices called out her name. Elizabeth, Is it true James is countersuing for defamation? Do you regret exposing your husband? How do you respond to the allegations that your story was motivated by personal revenge? Elizabeth held her head high, her expression unreadable. She had anticipated this. She was prepared. "I'm here today because the truth matters," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. James Holloway built his empire on lies and deceit. If standing here today means holding him accountable, then I have no regrets. As she turned to enter the courthouse, she caught a glimpse of James through the crowd. He stood at the entrance, flanked by his lawyers, his gaze locked onto hers with a smirk that no longer held its usual confidence. This was far from over. But Elizabeth wasn't the same woman she had been when this all started, and she was ready to finish what she had begun. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Elizabeth sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm but determined. Across from her, James Holloway leaned back in his chair, his once impeccable posture now slightly slouched, a visible weight pressing down on him. His legal team whispered frantically, flipping through documents, but Elizabeth could see it, the cracks in his armor. This wasn't just another business negotiation for James. This was survival. The judge cleared her throat, and the murmurs in the courtroom died down. Elizabeth sat up straighter, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her shoulders. She had spent years chasing justice for others. This time, she was fighting for herself. A few days earlier, Elizabeth had sat in her apartment, the one she had moved into after leaving the penthouse she once shared with James. The space was smaller, quieter, but it felt more like home than anything James had ever given her. Boxes were still scattered around, unpacked pieces of a life she was slowly rebuilding. Nathan sat across from her, watching as she organized the mountain of legal documents on her coffee table. "You don't have to go through with this, Liz," he said carefully, his voice softer than usual. "You already exposed him. The public knows who he really is." Elizabeth glanced up, her eyes filled with something deeper than anger. "This isn't just about exposing him, Nathan. It's about accountability. He needs to face real consequences, not just lose a few deals." Nathan leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "You're playing a dangerous game." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "I'm done playing. Now, I'm winning." Back in the courtroom, James' lead attorney stood to make his closing arguments. He spun the story with precision, painting Elizabeth as a woman scorned, a wife seeking vengeance rather than truth. He highlighted her personal connection, her emotions, implying that the exposé had been fueled by spite rather than journalistic integrity. Elizabeth listened, her heartbeat steady. She had expected this. When it was finally her turn, she stood, walking slowly to the front of the courtroom. She met the eyes of the jury, one by one, before speaking. For years, James Holloway presented himself as a man of integrity. She began, her voice clear and composed. A man of power, influence, and trust. I believed it. Many of us did. But beneath the surface, there was a different story, one of manipulation, fraud, and deception. She turned, her gaze landing briefly on James. He held it, his expression unreadable, but she knew she was getting through to him. "This isn't about revenge," she continued. "This is about the truth. The same truth I've dedicated my career to uncovering. James didn't just betray me. He betrayed his investors, his employees, and the very foundation he claimed to stand on." A pause. A beat of silence filled the room. "I exposed him because the world deserves to know the truth, no matter how inconvenient it is for people like James Holloway." Elizabeth took a breath and stepped back, meeting the judge's gaze. "Your Honor, I ask that this court holds him accountable, not just for me, but for everyone he's deceived." As she sat down, she felt Nathan squeeze her hand under the table. She didn't need his reassurance, but it was nice to have someone in her corner. The ruling came down a week later. James was found guilty of financial misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. His assets were frozen pending further investigation, his reputation now in irreparable shambles. Investors withdrew completely, his once glittering empire crumbling into dust. Elizabeth watched the news coverage from her new office at the Post, the headlines flashing across the screen. James Holloway's empire falls amid scandal. Elizabeth Carter. The journalist who took down a giant. She sipped her coffee, leaning back in her chair. It felt surreal, yet oddly satisfying. Not because James had fallen, but because she had risen from it stronger than she ever imagined. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see an unknown number. Hesitating for a moment, she answered. "Elizabeth Carter," she said, her voice steady. A familiar voice came through the line. "James, you won," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of defeat and something else, something Elizabeth couldn't quite place. She was silent for a moment before responding. "No, James, I didn't win. You just finally lost." A long pause stretched between them. "You know," he continued, "there was a time when I actually loved you." Elizabeth swallowed the lump in her throat, but her voice remained unwavering. "There was a time I loved who I thought you were." And with that, she ended the call, placing the phone on the desk with a finality that felt freeing. A few weeks later, Elizabeth found herself back in the same cafe where everything started, sipping tea with Nathan. The chaos of the past months had settled into something quieter, more manageable. She was starting fresh, and it felt good. "So," Nathan said, leaning back in his chair, "what's next for Elizabeth Carter?" She smiled, stirring her drink thoughtfully. "A new investigation, maybe. Or maybe I'll finally take that vacation I keep talking about." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Vacation? Liz Carter? Impossible." She laughed, a real, genuine laugh that she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. "Hey, I deserve it." As they talked, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't in years. Hope. Hope for a future where she was in control. Where she was more than just James Holloway's wife. She was Elizabeth Carter, and she was just getting started. Epilogue. Months later, Elizabeth walked through the bustling halls of the Post, a new fire in her stride. She had taken back control of her life, and her next big story was already in motion. But this time, it wasn't about exposing a cheating husband or a corrupt empire. It was about reinvention. Because if there was one thing Elizabeth Carter had learned, it was that power didn't come from money or reputation. It came from knowing your worth. And she was worth everything.